The morning she brought the last of the pole beans in, it was a Tuesday, the 14th of October, 1987, and the sky had gone the color of old pewter by 7 o'clock. Not the soft gray that means rain in this part of the country. Something harder than that. A flat, sealed-off kind of light, the kind that sits low on the horizon and does not move all day. And she said later that when she stepped off the back porch and felt the air on her face, she knew it the way you know a smell from your own barn, not because you reasoned it out, but because something older than reasoning told you. She said she turned around and went back inside, and she told her husband Earl that they had maybe 4 days, 5 at the outside, and that everything still in the ground needed to come out by Friday noon. Earl was a good man and a careful one, but he had farmed the same river-bottom ground for 31 years by that October, and the almanac on his nail by the kitchen door said the first hard freeze was not expected before the second week of November, and the Extension Office had sent out a newsletter that same month with a projected frost date of November 8th, plus or minus 4 days. He listened to her. He always listened to her, and then he went out and finished mending the south gate, which had needed mending since August, because a man can only hold so many warnings in his head at one time, and he had placed his bet on the almanac and the Extension Office newsletter, and both of them agreed with each other, and neither one of them agreed with her. I want to say, before I go any further, that Earl was not a fool, and he was not a dismissive man. He simply trusted the paper over the woman who had been reading this particular sky since she was 7 years old and following her own mother through these same fields. That is not a character flaw exactly. It is a very human kind of mistake, and I have made it myself more times than I am comfortable saying out loud. But she did not argue with him. She never argued much. She went back out past the porch steps and down the slope to the kitchen garden, and she started pulling. She worked through that Tuesday until the light failed, which was around 6:30, and she was back out Wednesday before 5 in the morning. And by Thursday evening, she had the better part of 300 row feet of root vegetables out of the ground and laid in the cellar in the old way, bedded in barely damp sand in wooden bins her father had built in 1951, with the turnips nearest the stair because they go first, and the parsnips and carrots along the east wall because the east wall holds at 38 degrees through January, and she knew that because her mother had told her, and her mother had known it, because she had tested it herself for 40 years with a mercury thermometer hung on a finish nail next to the first bin. The squash and the dry beans came in Friday morning. She was pulling the last of the Hubbards off their vines when her neighbor from the farm to the north came by in his truck, clean truck, always was. And he rolled the window down at the fence, and he said something to the effect that she looked like she was in a hurry, and she said she was. And he looked at the sky and then back at her, and he said the forecast called for partly cloudy through the weekend, and temperatures in the high 40s. She thanked him and kept pulling. He drove on. By Friday at noon, everything she had decided to pull was pulled. The cellar door was latched. The bins were full. She had put up in that cellar, in those 4 days, approximately 2,200 pounds of root vegetables, winter squash, dried beans, and late brassicas, all by herself. And she was 61 years old that October, and she weighed 137 pounds soaking wet. And I do not tell you that to make it miraculous. I tell you that because you should understand the kind of attention and the kind of stubbornness required, and because when people talk about this story later, they sometimes make it sound like she had some gift, some special faculty, and what she had was not a gift, but a practice, and the practice was not glamorous. It was cold mornings and aching hands, and a mother who taught her to watch the sky the same way you would watch a person whose moods you had to know in order to live with them. The freeze came Saturday night. Not a light frost, a freeze. The thermometer outside her kitchen window read 18 degrees by 6 in the morning on Sunday, October 18th, 1987, and it did not get above 26 degrees until Monday afternoon, and by then, everything still in the ground anywhere in the county was gone. Earl came in Sunday morning and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden, which was flat and black and glazed over, and he did not say anything for a long time. She poured him coffee. She did not say anything either. That was another thing her mother had taught her. There is a time to tell a man he was wrong, and there is a time to pour him coffee, and the time for the first thing is almost never right after he has already seen it for himself, because the seeing is enough, and adding words to it only builds a wall where you do not need one. He drank his coffee. He said after a while that the south field was gone. She said she knew. He said the pumpkins were gone, which he already knew because they had never been in the plan to bring in. They were a cash crop, and they were not ready yet, and he had gambled on the almanac date. She said she knew that too. He said, "How did you know?" And she said she did not know exactly. She just knew, the way she always knew, the way her mother had always known. He said her mother had been a remarkable woman. She said, yes. And that was the end of that conversation, which was also a very complete conversation. If you were the kind of person who understood how much two people can say in 4 sentences when they have been married 38 years and they are standing at a window looking at a field that cost them something. She did not say "I told you so," not that morning, not ever, because the cellar was already full, and the telling so would not have added a single parsnip to the first bin. Outside, the county was starting to understand what had happened. The Extension office would put out a revised frost date bulletin by Wednesday of that week, a document that confirmed what she had already acted on 4 days earlier, and the bulletin would use words like unprecedented and statistically anomalous, and she would read it at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she would fold it in half and set it down, and she would say nothing at all, because what was there to say? She had not done what she did because she was better than the Extension office. She had done what she did because her mother had given her a set of tools that the Extension office did not have, and the tools were not magic, and they were not science exactly. They were something older than either one, and something more patient than both. Now I want to tell you about the cellar itself, because the cellar is not incidental to this story. It is the whole story, or at least the half of it, that most people leave out when they tell it. The house had been on that ground since 1903, which meant the cellar had been dug in that same year by her grandfather, whose name was August, and who had come to this county from a part of Eastern Europe where the winters were not forgiving and where you did not survive the cold months on goodwill and optimism alone. You survived them because you had a plan, and the plan was underneath your house, and the plan was full of things you had put there in September and October, when the ground still gave them up willingly. August had dug the cellar 8 feet deep, which was 2 feet deeper than most people dug them in this part of the country, because he had learned somewhere back in the old country, or somewhere in the crossing over, that a cellar 6 feet deep will lose its stable temperature in a hard winter, and a cellar 8 feet deep will not. And that difference is the difference between your carrots lasting to February and your carrots going soft by Christmas. He had lined the walls in field stone, dry stacked with care, and he had laid a sand floor, not dirt, because a sand floor drains and a dirt floor holds water. And held water means rot, and rot means you are eating what you can salvage instead of what you laid in. He had built the wooden bins along 3 walls, and he had put in a single small ventilation shaft in the northeast corner, fitted with a wooden plug that could be opened a half-inch or closed completely, depending on the outside temperature, because a cellar needs air, but it does not need much of it. And the management of that ventilation shaft over the winter months was itself a kind of practice, a kind of reading and responding. Open it a little on a 40-degree November night, close it hard on an 18-degree October night, and the range inside the cellar stays between 34 and 40 degrees for 5 months without any other intervention, if you have built the thing right, and if you are paying attention. She had been paying attention to that cellar since she was a girl. She had helped her mother pack the bins every October from the time she was 8 years old. She knew which corner ran cold and which wall ran warm. She knew that the second bin from the left on the north wall was the one that would turn a carrot to mush first if the ventilation shaft was left open on a hard freeze, because the cold air dropping in the shaft fell toward that corner and pooled. She knew it because her mother had shown her, and her mother had learned it because August had written it down. He had kept a ledger, not a fancy thing. A composition book, dark blue cover, cloth-bound at the spine, gone soft at the corners from decades of handling, and in it he had recorded, in a penmanship that was careful and deliberate and slightly formal, the way people wrote when they had learned to write in another language first, temperature readings and storage notes and harvest dates going back to 1903. Her mother had found the ledger in a wooden crate on the cellar workbench after August died in 1941, and her mother had read it, and her mother had then added to it in her own hand, continuing the record in the same composition book because there were still 30 pages left. And when her mother died in 1974, she had found the ledger in the same crate on the same workbench where August had left it 47 years before, as though it had never needed to move, as though the information in it was tied to the place, and the place was where it belonged. She had read it that winter of 1974, sitting on a three-legged stool under a single bulb hung from the ceiling joist, and she had read it slowly, all of it, August's pages and her mother's pages both, and she had understood for the first time that she was not the keeper of a garden, but the keeper of a record, and the record was longer than her own life, and it expected her to continue it. She had bought a new composition book at the drugstore in town, dark blue to match the original, and she had begun her own entries that same November, and she had been adding to it every October and November since, 13 years of her own observations set down alongside August's and her mother's, and the three of them together constituted 84 years of continuous temperature and harvest records from the same piece of ground, and there is not a data set in the Extension Office's files that comes close to that, though I would not expect them to say so. The ledger. I keep coming back to it because she kept coming back to it, and because the specific thing in it that mattered most to this story was not any one temperature reading or any one harvest date, but a single note in August's hand, written in the margin of an October page from 1919 in ink gone brown with age, which read, in his slightly formal English, "Sky seals before the cold comes in." Sky seals meaning the flat pewter sky closes off, the high clouds go away, the color drains out of the horizon before dawn and does not come back. He had underlined it. He had not written anything else next to it, no explanation, no qualification, just those 4 words and a line under them. And when she read them in the winter of 1974, she had understood exactly what he meant, because she had seen that sky her whole life, and she had never had a word for it before. And here was her grandfather, 33 years dead, handing her the word for it from across the decades. And the word was not a word at all, but a description, sky seals, before the cold comes in, and she wrote it in her own ledger that same night, and underlined it the same way he had underlined it, and from that night forward, it was the thing she watched for, the sign, above all other signs, the thing that told her when to pull and when to carry in, and when to latch the cellar door. The morning of October 14th, 1987, when she stepped off the back porch and looked at the horizon and felt the air on her face, the sky had sealed, completely and unmistakably. Flat pewter from one edge to the other, no horizon distinction, no depth to the light, just that sealed quality, that closed-off gray that August had written about in the margin of an October page, 55 years before she read it. And she had known, not because she was remarkable, because she had read the ledger. I want to tell you now about the weeks that followed, because the story does not end with the freeze. It continues on into November and December, and the long January that came after, which was the coldest January in that county since 1936, though nobody predicted that either when October was over. The supply line into the county ran through a 2-lane road that connected to the highway, and that road crossed a low bridge over the river, and the river ran high in November that year on account of the ground being frozen hard before the late rains could soak in, and the combination of high water and a sustained cold snap in the first week of December took out one of the bridge's timber supports, and the county closed it for repairs on December 9th, and it did not reopen until January 22nd. 44 days. The other road, the gravel road that went around the long way, was passable in good weather and impassable in bad, and that December and January had more bad weather than good. The grocery in town had been stocked for a normal winter, not a siege, and by the second week of December the shelves were running thin on the things that matter most in cold months, which are root vegetables and dried beans, and the kind of food that keeps without refrigeration and feeds a person through 4 or 5 hours of outdoor work without asking them to stop and eat again. People managed. They did what people do. They shared, and they improvised, and they drove the long gravel road when they had to, but it was a hard stretch, and there were families, especially families with a lot of children or with elderly people in them, who were running genuinely short by Christmas. And this is the part of the story that the people who tell it tend to get sentimental about, which I understand, but which also slightly misrepresents what actually happened, because what happened was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a grand act of charity delivered from a height of abundance. It was something more ordinary and more admirable than that. She opened the cellar. She did not announce it. She did not make a list or set up a distribution system or consult with the county or ask anyone's permission. She walked down to the cellar on the morning of December 15th, and she opened the bins, and she started figuring out what she could give and what she needed to keep and what the margin was. And then she called her neighbor to the north, the one with the clean truck because he had a truck, and she needed someone with a truck to help her move weight. And he came over, and he went down into the cellar with her, and he stood there in the low light looking at those bins and at those walls lined in August's fieldstone, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said he had not known she had this much down here. She said she had been putting things by for a long time, and this year she had put by more than usual. He looked at the bins, and he looked at her, and he asked her if she had known the bridge was going to go out, and she said no, she had not known that. She had only known the freeze was coming, and she had pulled accordingly. He nodded. He did not say anything else about whether he had believed her in October when she was pulling in the garden, and he was rolling his window down at the fence to tell her the forecast called for high 40s. He just picked up a bin of carrots and started carrying. They moved weight out of that cellar for 3 days. She kept careful records of what went where, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had been August's daughter, and August had written everything down, and she was not about to break a 63-year chain of record-keeping in the middle of a hard winter. She had a notebook of her own, a spiral-bound one she kept in the kitchen for the practical running of the household, and she wrote in it the date and the weight and the recipient, and those entries are still readable today, and they account for 412 pounds of carrots, 280 pounds of turnips and parsnips combined, 160 pounds of beets, 90 pounds of dried beans distributed in 2-pound paper bags she had saved from the summer, 75 pounds of cured winter squash, and 40 pounds of late brassicas that she had put in the coolest corner of the cellar, and which had kept remarkably well on account of the temperature holding steady through early December. That is over 1,000 pounds of food distributed to 27 households in 3 days, and she still had enough left in the bins to carry herself and Earl through to the first week of March. She knew she did because she had calculated it before she opened the cellar door, the same way August had calculated it, which is to say, she walked the bins and she counted, and she estimated weights, and she applied the consumption rates she knew from a lifetime of feeding 2 people through a winter, and the arithmetic came out with a margin. And she gave the margin away and kept the baseline. And if you are the kind of person who looks at that and thinks it sounds cold or mechanical, I would ask you to consider that it is exactly that kind of cold mechanical precision that makes generosity sustainable rather than theatrical, because a dramatic gesture that leaves you short in February is not generosity, it is sentiment, and sentiment does not warm the house. There was a woman in town, name I will not use, who ran the small canning operation out of her house and who had, over the years, developed a certain reputation for knowing her business, and she came out to the cellar in the third week of December because she had heard from the neighbor with the clean truck that there were beets in the cellar that were coming out of the bins in near-perfect condition after 2 months of storage, and she wanted to see them for herself. She was the kind of person I would call a quiet, validating expert, not someone who throws credentials around, but someone who has handled enough produce over enough years that they know what they are looking at, and they know when what they are looking at is not ordinary. She came down the cellar stairs, and she stood in front of the north wall bins with a flashlight, and she picked up a carrot, and she looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then she picked up a turnip, then a beet. She held the beet in both hands and turned it slowly, the way you would examine a thing you were not entirely certain was real. She set it down carefully. Then she was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that you would have noticed it, and she said one word. She said, "Exceptional." Not as a compliment exactly, more as a finding, the way a person in her position says a word and means by it that the evidence in front of her is outside the normal range of what she expects to see. She asked about the storage method, and she asked about the ventilation shaft, and she asked how deep the cellar ran, and when she heard 8 feet she nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed. She asked to see the ledger. It was brought out, both volumes, August's and her mother's, and the running record of her own entries. The woman from the canning operation sat on the 3-legged stool under the single bulb, and she read for a long time without speaking, turning the pages slowly, and when she finished she closed the book, and she sat with it in her lap, and she said, "Nobody has records like this, not around here." She said it the way you say something that is both an observation and a slight adjustment of your own understanding of the world, a quiet recalibration in the presence of evidence you were not expecting. She asked if she could bring a colleague in the spring, a man she knew who worked in soil science and who she thought would want to see the temperature records from the cellar and from the garden. She said he had been looking for exactly this kind of long-term ground temperature data and had not been able to find it in any institutional archive because nobody had thought to keep it, and nobody had kept it, except apparently August in 1903 and a woman in her 80s in a farmhouse on a river-bottom road who had been adding to his ledger for 84 years. She said yes, he could come. She said she had coffee. The neighbor with the clean truck, the one who had rolled his window down in October to tell her the forecast called for high 40s. He came by again in the second week of January, when the road was icy and the river was still frozen and the bridge was still out, and the county was in the middle of what would turn out to be the coldest 20 days of that entire winter. He pulled in at the gate, and he got out of the truck, which, I will note, was considerably less clean than it had been in October, because January will do that to a truck in this part of the country, and he came up to the door and knocked, and she let him in and gave him coffee. And he sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked up, and he said, "That was not as wet a fall as I thought it was going to be," meaning the garden, meaning the root vegetables, meaning the harvest she had pulled in when he had been rolling his window down to tell her the forecast called for high 40s, meaning all of it, meaning he had thought about it, and he had come to say something, and the thing he had come to say was as close as a man of his particular disposition and his particular generation was ever going to get to saying, "You were right, and I was wrong." And she understood that, and she accepted it in the spirit it was offered, which was genuine, which was enough. She poured him more coffee. She asked after his family. He said they were getting on. He said the road was a mess. She said she knew. He said he appreciated the carrots she had sent over. In December, his wife had made a soup. She said she was glad. He finished his coffee and he put on his coat, and he shook her hand at the door, which was a slightly formal thing to do, but was also somehow right, a gesture that meant something more than its surface. And he drove on up the road through the January ice, and she watched the truck go, and then she went back inside, and she wrote the date in the spiral notebook, and she wrote, "Neighbor came by. Carrots well received." That is all she wrote, because that is all there was to write, and because she was a woman who understood the difference between what a thing meant and how much space it required on a page. I have been thinking about this story for a long time, and I think the thing that stays with me most is not the frieze, and it is not the cellar, and it is not even the ledger, though the ledger is remarkable, and I will come back to the ledger in a moment. The thing that stays with me is the specificity of the knowledge, the way it was particular to that place, and to that cellar, and to that sky, the way it had been built up over 63 years by 3 people, who each understood that they were not farming alone, they were farming in a line. They were the current edge of something that extended backward through time and would extend forward if they kept the record and passed it on. August had sealed it in a composition book. Her mother had continued it. She had continued it further. And the knowledge in it was not abstract. It was not transferable to some other county or some other set of soils or some other sky. It was knowledge of this place, tested against this place, refined by this place, and it was real in the way that only long observation of a particular thing can be real. The Extension Office Bulletin, the Almanac, the forecast, those are good tools, and I do not dismiss them. They are built on real data and real method, and they serve a real purpose. But they are built on wide averages, and a wide average will tell you what the middle of the county is likely to do, and it will not tell you what your particular piece of ground on your particular river bottom, with your particular sky, will do on a Tuesday in October when the light seals over, and an 18-degree freeze is sitting 4 days out. For that you need 63 years of records from the same cellar, and you need the patience to read them, and you need a grandfather who noticed a thing in 1919, and wrote it in the margin in ink that went brown and held. Sky seals before the cold comes in, 4 words and a line under them. That is the whole inheritance, if you know how to receive it. The soil scientist came in May as promised, and he spent the better part of 2 days in the cellar and in the garden, taking temperature readings and soil samples and looking at the ledger under his own small magnifier, making his own notes in his own notebook. And when he was done and he was packing up his equipment at the gate, he stopped and he said that the temperature record in the cellar was, in his considered opinion, one of the most complete continuous microclimate data sets he had encountered in 40 years of fieldwork in this part of the country. He said he would like, with her permission, to include a reference to it in a paper he was preparing on long-term soil temperature patterns. He said the record was, and this is the word he used, this is the word he chose, substantial. He said it the way the woman from the canning operation had said, exceptional, as a finding, not a compliment. She said he was welcome to reference it, and she hoped it was useful. He said he was fairly certain it would be. He got in his car, and he drove away, and she stood at the gate for a moment, and then she went inside, and she wrote the date in the spiral notebook, and next to it she wrote, "Scientist came. Ledger, useful. That is all." No triumph in it, no satisfaction beyond what the facts warranted, because she was August's granddaughter, and August had not kept 63 years of temperature records so that someone could feel satisfied about them. He had kept them so that whoever came after him would know, in October, when the sky had sealed and the freeze was 4 days out, and the almanac and the extension office and the neighbor with the clean truck all disagreed, would know to trust the sky over the paper and the cellar over the forecast, and to pull accordingly, and to latch the door, and to have enough left in the bins in December to carry 27 households through to the other side of the bridge going out, and the January coming in hard, and the cold not breaking until the 22nd. I will tell you the last thing, and then I will leave you to your own ground. She kept the ledger going until she was 84 years old, and her hands made the writing difficult. And then she taught her granddaughter, who had been coming out to the farm in October since she was 10 years old, and who had helped pack the bins and manage the ventilation shaft and read the old entries. She taught the granddaughter how to continue the record, and the granddaughter has continued it. And as of the last October I have knowledge of, the ledger is 91 years old, and it contains the observations of 4 people across 4 generations from the same cellar on the same river bottom ground. And nobody has ever published it, and nobody has ever applied for a grant to study it, and it has never been submitted to any database or any archive. It lives in a crate on the same workbench where August left it in 1941, dark blue cover, cloth-bound spine, corners soft from handling, and it is the most complete piece of knowledge I know of about that particular place. And it was built the only way such a thing can be built, which is slowly, 1 October at a time, by people who understood that their job was not to figure out the county's weather, but to figure out their own sky, and who had the patience to keep writing it down, even in the years when nothing remarkable happened, especially in the years when nothing remarkable happened, because the unremarkable years are the ones that build the baseline against which the remarkable ones are measured. And without the baseline you cannot read the anomaly, and without reading the anomaly you are standing in your garden in mid-October watching the sky seal over and feeling the air go hard on your face and not knowing what you are feeling, not having the word for it, not knowing to pull. She had the word because August wrote it down. The granddaughter has it now. The cellar is still 8 feet deep. The east wall still runs 38 degrees. The second bin from the left on the north wall is still the one you watch. Some things do not need updating. They need continuing. If you have a piece of ground you have been reading for a long time, or a set of records someone older left you that you have not yet finished understanding, or a note in someone else's hand that you keep coming back to because it says something you always knew and never had the words for. I would like to hear about it in the comments. That is what this channel is for, or at least part of what it is for. The other part is the slow kind of knowing that takes more than one season to build, and I think most people who find their way here already understand that. Subscribe if this meant something. We will keep going.